Hi, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all listen to me properly. My name is Maria, and I will be hosting this roundtable, which will focus on our game Curators, and is part of OASIS, the video game exhibition taking place this week at ESNE University. So I'm going to briefly introduce the session today, and then I will present our panelists, and then they will have some time to talk about their work. So at the beginning of the 21st century, a new movement began to take shape in the field of independent video games. Artistic musical events started welcoming arcades and alternative games. And so festivals, pop-up events, and our game exhibitions of different shapes and sizes were born almost simultaneously in different parts of the world. An independent kind of game was born, developing in parallel with the art circuit and mainstream video game events and congresses. The producers and curators did not know each other, but they had a lot in common. They enjoyed games and understood the video game as a cultural object. They saw it as an artistic expression, and they believed there was another path different from the mainstream one. Our panel today is made of 4 international curators who will talk about their experience, the paths they took to become curators, the projects they are working on, the games they are interested in, and the possibilities developers may have to take part in these kind of events. So our first curator is Isabelle. I'm not really sure how to pronounce your surname, Isabelle, so you will.
Arvers.
Oh, well, that's very difficult for me. I can't speak French. I'm really sorry. So Isabelle is a French PhD candidate. She's an artist and curator whose research focuses on the relationship between art and video games. For the last 20 years, she has been studying the artistic, ethical, and critical implications of digital games. And as a curator, she focuses on video games as a new language for artists. So Isabelle, the stage is yours. You can.
Thank you. So I will share my screen. Just tell me if that's okay, if you can see my screen. And is it okay? Yeah, okay. So to start, so I'm an art and game curator. I've been curating game and art exhibition for the last 20, maybe 25 years. I started in 97. And actually, if I started to curate art and game exhibitions, because I talked with some teenagers who told me that they were dreaming in video games. So that's where I understood that games were a very serious question. And that in order to create a counter strategy in front of the main big game publisher, I started to show alternative, artistic, and more experimental games. And I've been doing for the last, let's say, 20 years. I also tried to show how games can be used as a medium. So for the music or for filmmaking in machinima. And the main point for me when I curate a game art exhibition is the idea of mixing art disciplines. So, for example, I will show you one of the first exhibition I curated. It was in 2002, a big one in a physical space at La Grande Halle de la Villette. And the idea was to mix cinema, music, new media art, and also games in order to attract the audience that might not come to this kind of event otherwise, but also in order to show to the contemporary art world that games could be a cultural object. At that time, it was not not easy to get that point. So that was the party time, and but the exhibition was also open during the night. And this idea of mixing disciplines and to mix games with art and music and cinema, we kept it with an event that we used to organize with Chloé Desmoineaux from 2017 to 2009. The name is Artgames Demo, and the idea was to to organize let's say a before party and to mix video art, animation, machinima, but also presentation of games in order to create the encounter between artists, game makers, and also different kind of audiences that otherwise, again, wouldn't see any games or any video art or animation. And in 2019, I decided to decentralize my, let's say my practice as a curator. And I started a project, the name is the Art and Game World Tour, which is a project that I started focusing on female, queer, feminist and decolonial practices. So far I visited 15 countries from the global south, so in South Asia, Latin America and Africa, in order to meet and interview artists who are using games as a medium or game makers. And there are like different goals for this project, but one of them is to create a decolonial geography of art and video games. And it also aims to create new types of collaborations. And the idea was through machinima workshops. So I do a lot of machinima workshop where I teach people how to make movies with video games. But because I was like meeting game makers along my journey, I asked them if I could use these games in my machinima workshop in order to disseminate these games along my journey and to be able to work on intercultural storytelling. So for example, when I was in Buenos Aires, because Lou invited me to curate a show, mostly political games or historical games, I was able to also give a workshop, and Laura Palavecino did a movie with a game, Wandering Wonder, by Komitsu Fujihata. So just to speak a little bit more about this idea of intercultural storytelling. During this journey, I also curated exhibitions on different kind of subjects. You tell me, I don't know if I already have 5 minutes or I hope.
It's okay.
It's okay? Okay.
Yes.
So
you've got like 5 minutes more.
Okay, thank you very much. So during the journey, I curated some exhibitions, art and games or VR experiences. One of them, by the way, was somehow co-curated with Thorsten in Nairobi. The name was Jiban Benatek, How to Have Fun with Technology. And I was in charge more of the physical gaming exhibition. And I tried to present games and VR experiences coming from Nigeria, South Africa, Ghana, and I think, and Kenya, of course. Otherwise, the main point of these exhibitions were to try to see how we can better understand the history, the politics, or the cultural aspects of a country through their games. And while I was still traveling when the pandemic happened, and I was in Ghana when the borders closed, and I had the time just to pass to Togo, and I stayed there 5 months during the first confinement. And thanks to that stay, at the end of my journey in Togo, I had the chance to be able to organize a machinima workshop, but with traditional storytellers. And it was a very like co-learning experience. I learned a lot, and I hope they also learned a lot. But what happened is that we were working in a studio of an artist who is also into voodoo, and I became the high priestess of machinima. But anyway, that's when I started to realized that we could perhaps use games or like digital technology in order to promote, to echo, or to archive and document ancestral knowledge and oral tradition, which is now what I've been doing. And sorry, and more lately, I just gave this machinima workshop, but now I call it like decolonizing the imaginary through counter gaming tactics at Beaux-Arts in Brussels. So again, using the games encountered during the journey, but also other type of games in order to be able to hijack them. And most of the participants were Afro-descendants. So we are keeping on this idea of, yeah, using games in order to be able to take some distance, some critical distance toward the games, and in order to speak about these games and maybe all the consequences in terms of environment, in terms of representation. So to use games as a medium to even be critical toward games.
Thank you, Isabelle, for your such an interesting work. If you could stop sharing your screen.
Sure, for sure, pardon.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much for such an interesting presentation of your work. I'm sure all the other panelists will have some questions for you later on. I don't know if you want to ask them now or we move and then at the end we can like engaged in a conversation all together, right? Okay. So I am moving, now we're moving to Thorsten. He's the founder of and director of Amaze. Under this international label, he produces and curates festivals, exhibitions, and workshops on the intersection between games, games culture, and playful media. He has created 2 annual international festivals to present independent games and virtual reality. His focus is on filling the gaps between games, art, and technology. He lives and works in Berlin right now, if I'm not wrong. So Thorsten, would love to hear more about Amaze.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. It's the first event, I think, OASIS, right? And it's good to have more those events because over the pandemic, I also realized that a lot of cool events just disappeared because they had not the budget or they were not going completely digital. So hopefully in the next years, all the games festival coming back again. So yeah, I started in 2008 with this idea of Amaze. And to be frank, I had no idea about games. So this is something, I was also not a gamer or something like that. That was completely not my part of life, but it became, because I saw this kind of interest of people, how to use technology. And I was always interested in media art, new media art. Was never an artist. I just visited all the festivals, Transmediale, Ars Electronica, and saw a lot of cool things happening there in this kind of field. And also found artists who worked already with game engines back in 2000, 2001, I think it started. So, but nothing was really around video games in Germany, not even really in Europe. What was really discussing art and games or the conversions between art and games and other media. There was nothing what lifted it to a cultural level. It was more like always talking about products and stuff like that. So we started then with small bar events. I'm going to start sharing as well the screen. Let me see if I can do this. Oops, this is the wrong one. How can I get back here now? Oh. And here it is. Oh, I'm always. So yeah, so this is Amaze. Thank you. And yeah, we're doing festival now since basically 2008. We started with small bar events. I invited some people around Berlin. People were super happy to display their games for the first time or show some interactive art. And then it became a festival, and we started just with 40 people, and then now this is around this year for the one-day event where 600 people coming, and this is really satisfying to see so many people having interests, the same interests as we have, and kind of creating this community around art house games. I mean, we started with indie games in 2012. What was the Indie Connect, Amaze Indie Connect. But then we just saw, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening in the indie games world. So it's almost already III, AAA, or however you want to call it. I mean, it's really a big thing now, indie games. And I'm thinking now, okay, Amaze is the best festival for finding niches. And so we thought, okay, we just talk about art house games now, and try to make events around that, and as well include other institutions. So we're working with Goethe Institute together, with British Council, with Institut Français, and we do different kind of stuff. We did as well festivals in Ukraine, for example, 5 years in Kosovo. We always find partners who are actually not expert in video games. So we bring the aspect of video games in their cultural field. And this is something what is very interesting. So we're working a lot with film festivals and music festivals, and as well with activism festivals. And we also had a festival in Johannesburg for over 7 years. So, but we're not just doing festivals. We also have an award, which I think is very important if you want to lift those games to lift it a little bit more up and to give it more visibility. I think the Amaze Award just grew by itself because people are really thinking now like that they want to do games which have a real meaning or is contemporary, and want to tell stories or find interactions or mechanics which are unusual for the games industry. And I see a lot of people from the games industry coming to Amaze Festival and say, wow, this is incredible. I mean, maybe this is also for the bigger studios then say, hey, hopefully they are not stealing their ideas, but I mean, they're definitely going to get inspired by everything what they see in the exhibitions. And we have 7 awards, and it's always fun to present the games then as well in the exhibition space, in the festival space. And now we as well have the Amaze space. I can talk later about it. Yeah. So the next festival will be in May 10th to 13th, just if you want to know that. But besides that, we also create playful media residencies. Like the Brain. So we bring different people with different kind of artistic expertise together, not per se game developers, but people who can use game engines, people who can write text, people who understand how to make VR worlds, and musicians and thinkers. And we always have a topic, and we bring them together in Berlin, and they work for a month together in Berlin to create something like that. So next time we're gonna do something together with Michel Granger. He's very famous because of Oxygen. He made the cover for Jean-Michel Jarre, and so we want to bring VR developers and storytellers together to actually pick up the idea of his work and bring it together into this kind of topic of sustainability and harmony. So this is going to be the next one. So we're looking for 3 artists who are working then in Berlin and create this piece. So we also work with theaters together. I mean, I couldn't imagine when we started Amaze that people will talk to us from this kind of high cultural scene, community, theater, opera. Oh my God. So, I mean, video games, this is not what it's fitting at all. So, but they reached out 2 years ago and they just said, hey, we want to work something out together. And then we created this game jam, and 48 hours, game developers with theater people for the first time coming together. Berliner Ensemble and Komische Oper are really high-ranked theaters in Berlin with a really good program, and working with those people together was just like a super inspiring time, also to give the game developers firstly the opportunity to also see and look behind the stage and see how many people are working there. And it was just like fantastic. And also, I mean, the game developers shared their experience. So how they work, how the workflow is, and so on. And they created them games together. It was really successful. Then also museums. I mean, but it was a development, I mean, over the last 10 years, it wasn't just like happening like this. Now, Leipzig Association started to work with us together. Last year, we did the first game jam about museums games. And this year we wanted to do something with AR. And we created everything online, of course. They don't want to have a physical game jam or hackathon. But it was really good because then it was very international. It was good for them to get reach, also to get into the community of game developers and media artists, playful media artists. And this is something hopefully is going to be ongoing, and especially when we are talking about curating exhibitions. I never really curated a real exhibition, I mean, I do festivals, I do some kind of small shows, but it's not like Marie did, so big thing, with a lot of context and a lot of research. And this is something what I really want to do in the future. So, I mean, this is something what's very inspiring when other people doing it already. So we also work with other artists together. We do a train jam in South Africa, and we go from Joburg to Cape Town. The last 2 years, we couldn't do it physically. So we do it online. And this time, last year, we invited 5 artists from South Africa to give their art to the game developers and also work together with the game developers on their art and make a game out of it. It was also very interesting, also to bring other artists closer to the games community. Yeah, so this is some kind of exhibition we created at Playtopia back in 2018. So we also had, then during COVID, we made a lot of stuff in VR chat, also performances and tours and exhibitions and workshops. Then, and then we have the Amaze Space. The Amaze Space is something what I really, really like to work more and more on it, because it's something what interests me a lot now, because we learned a lot over the last 2 years how to use technology differently. And I never was thinking that I'm going to produce or create a space, a virtual space. But having that, so it's just like super inspiring, because first of all, I learn how to make games, basically. So not in the mind of game design or narrative, but more like how the whole workflow works, how much work it is actually as well to make a game. Because as a curator, usually I don't know, maybe you are all game developers, but I have no idea, or had no idea how hard it is actually to make a game. And making the space was also very hard. So it was very frustrating. So that we had, for example, 2021, we had no space. And this space is completely new now. And I mean, there's so many new opportunities in this kind of world, not doing physical events, bringing people more close together to the digital world, presenting it differently as you could present it in the physical world. And also game developers are also very excited to have those kind of spaces. And this for me is basically the future of Amaze. And that's my presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Thorsten, for showing us where Amaze is. We are amazed, of course. So I don't really remember. It was Marie. It was Marie.
Yep, Marie.
Yeah, okay. So Marie is an award-winning curator and creative director of radical exhibitions, installations, and experiences. She specializes in embodied storytelling, which means inviting audiences to be present within and travel through narrative experiences. She's led the creative vision for headline exhibitions, immersive AV installations, interactive displays, arcade club nights, and even photography workshops for spacemen in virtual alien worlds. Past clients and collaborators include the Smithsonian, the Design Museum, the Royal Opera House, Penguin Random House, and Netflix, among others. So, Mary, we are really excited to know a little bit more about you.
Thank you, Maria. That's my slightly bombastic bio from my website, which has far more superlatives than I'll probably be putting into this intro. But yeah, obviously, first of all, thank you so much for having me. And it's really great to be, again, as Thorsten says, sort of great to be having events again and being able to talk about like our curatorial practices in this sort of space and to be alongside such inspiring people. One note or two notes. One, there's a heat wave here today and I'm a very delicate flower, so I'm a little bit hot and confused. So if I don't have all of my faculties with me, then that is why. And the other thing is that there's a little dog sleeping on my sofa in front of the fan. But if she hears a doorbell or a car door slamming, then she's going to go off like a firecracker. So if I start muting, that's why. Anyway, I do not have a glossy presentation like everybody else. Instead, we're going to be digging through, if I can figure out how to share my screen, we're just going to be digging through some folders on my desktop. Is that going to actually show the file? So we're going to start off with, what is that sharing? That's not showing the right thing, is it? Is that showing the right thing? Can you see the picture or could you see the file folder?
We can't see everything, but the picture is like very small on the right.
Okay, I'm gonna make, give me 2 seconds. Yeah. We're gonna, please bear with me whilst we sort some technical difficulties out.
It's okay.
I'm putting these in, this is why people put things in presentations, but I do have to say, I'm always a fan of people who don't, and then you can just get these sneaky little glimpses into people's desktops and their messy folder structures. So this should be a little bit better. Can you see the picture now? Hey, there we go.
That's perfect. Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Cool. So I think this is probably going to be a little bit out of order, or maybe it's still in order. But yeah, so my name is Maria, and I'm I consider myself, I call myself like a curator, but also more increasingly creative director, working within sort of video games and digital culture. So I guess like a lot of people or peers who sort of work in this space, my background is one which did not start by calling myself a curator initially. It was work that was really born out of a desire to create public spaces that allowed for the exhibition of what was sort of happening in sort of the early sort of 2010s, was that sort of resurgence of sort of the independent games movement. And within that sort of a lot of work that was very performative, very speculative, like a lot of what we now sort of call like alt control games. And so it was a lot of work which was, for me, sort of really inspiring to suddenly realize, like, hang on a minute, there's this whole sort of alternative and independent sort of strand and community and different communities that are sort of present within video games that I hadn't actually been sort of that familiar with. And I was really excited about that. But as someone who wasn't a games designer, and equally, I think sort of as Thorsten said, as someone who didn't consider myself sort of in the traditional mode of what you'd consider to be somebody who played video games or engaged with that sort of more mainstream sort of concept of what it means to sort of be a fan of games, was something that I didn't see myself reflected in. And so the work that I did was sort of forming or becoming sort of part of a collective called the Wild Rumpus in the UK. And we're sort of a group of different people who are different sort of designers, journalists, and curators, who were all just sort of really felt compelled to create more public spaces that allowed for the exhibition of this sort of new rise of independent works in places that were sort of sympathetic to the work, but spaces that perhaps welcomed different audiences, that were sort of spaces that reflected sort of the energy and the style of games that were present. So in the photograph here, you can see sort of one of our events that took place in San Francisco sort of many years ago as part, sort of alongside the Game Developers Conference out there. And the work that you've got here is the UCLA Game Labs arcade backpack, which is, as I always joke, sort of the true epitome of mobile gaming. But this is essentially a backpack that people can wear around sort of an event, and people can sort of play the games that are loaded onto that. And so again, this isn't sort of work that, unless you're going to these events or this work is exhibited physically, these aren't sort of works that people would have the ability to necessarily experience. So, oh, I've got the beach ball of doom. There we go. And now we can see sort of another photograph of some of the work or from some of those events. So the majority of things that we did as Wild Rumpus was hosting what we term sort of like video game club nights. So there were events that took place primarily in bars and in sort of nightclubs within London in the UK. And for each event, we'd curate a selection of maybe sort of 10 to 15 video games. And these were predominantly games and works which were sort of quite physical, had sort of elements of sort of spectacle about them. So as you can see here, this is a game in which people have PlayStation Move controllers tied to their ankles, and they're trying to attempt to stomp on each other's PlayStation controllers and push them under the water to be able to disconnect them. But yeah, and so the works were generally sort of this sort of vein, quite physical, quite DIY. There's also a lot of multiplayer games as well. So the strand of curation for these events was really sort of predominantly looking towards work that really works well in these very sort of public, very sort of like works in sort of pub settings, works in sort of club settings, works in that sort of very social public spaces. And over the years, that work was something that began to gain sort of interest from different galleries and museums and more sort of traditional cultural institutions internationally. And just to caveat this as well, that this was something that was heavily inspired by sort of what was developing at the time and still persists now, is that sort of scene of independent collectives and curators internationally. So our work was very heavily influenced by collectives such as Baby Castles in New York. It was influenced by Gamma or Kokoromi in Canada, and collectives such as the Copenhagen Game Collective, obviously in Copenhagen. So it's work that we didn't sort of necessarily come up with this concept. It was something where we saw similar events and projects happening internationally. And that was sort of something that chimed with our desire to create more public spaces for this work to be exhibited in the UK. And sort of through doing that work, and I think it's something that felt like a learning curve, or perhaps sort of taking a collective group of peers working in this space, beginning to take themselves seriously, or like, and not seriously as in sort of po-face, but seriously as in sort of understanding, appreciating the value of the work that we were doing, but also the works that we were showing as well, was that more and more people, I think, began to become confident about calling themselves a curator. And so as that sort of formalized for myself, and I started to call myself a video game curator through this work, through selecting these games and creating these events, that is something that, as they say, sort of, if you want to be something, you kind of just sometimes have to call yourself it. And as soon as I started calling myself a video game curator, funnily, this is when, around about the time when the Victoria and Albert Museum got in touch, and through a very sort of series of circumstances, I ended up sort of joining the Victoria and Albert Museum in London as their curator of video games. And so primarily the role that I had there was working on sort of a major headline exhibition. And this was a huge sort of jump for me in terms of the scope of work that I was undertaking. So I've gone from this sort of really DIY, scrappy sort of approach to curation, where we're really figuring things out for ourselves and sort of trialing, sort of trial and error in terms of what we find sort of works at events and what doesn't. And equally sort of holding things together with gaffer tape, not really having much budget, not really knowing sort of what we're doing in a sort of formalized concept, just suddenly going to a very large institution that has this huge history of big exhibitions and sort of processes and formats that they go through things, as well as being in a space that has much bigger budgets. So as I say, so this photograph is of some of the late events. So whilst I was at the V&A predominantly working on this video games exhibition that opened in 2018, there was also a range of other projects and work that I undertook there. So this is a photograph from one of our late events, which are sort of these events that happen sort of as they do in most museums internationally, sort of where different artists and designers are invited to take over a museum sort of a late night sort of experience. And we hosted a couple of those around the themes of sort of video games. Yeah, so the exhibition that I worked on there was one which was, it was called Video Games Design, Play, Disrupt. And this took place from 2018 through to 2019. And it was an exhibition that, again, sort of, whilst it was one which, so it was an exhibition that sort of in the same scope that the V&A sort of sets itself out, that this is an exhibition that really wants to look at video games through the lens of design, understand them as design objects. And equally sort of the museum, the V&A is a museum that is very interested in design process. And so we wanted to find different ways of beginning to open that up. And so the mode of curation and sort of the style and format that I was exhibiting in was sort of quite sort of radically different in terms of the work that I was undertaking. That for one, it was no longer a case of necessarily just selecting works that fitted the public context that we were exhibiting in, that it was actually having to look at a much broader range of video games. So also embracing and looking at the work of AAA games and sort of more mainstream work. And also not necessarily just focusing on the playable game, but looking at some of the design artifacts and the materials that actually begin to open up the way that those works were designed and sort of experienced as well. So this is just a couple of the photographs from that exhibition. There's more sort of documentations and talks that I've given online that sort of can go into detail about what that work was. Yeah, and so here's some of the very fancy sort of nice installations we're allowed to do. And oh, how did that get in there? This is a photograph of my dog, which I've just put in because she's very cute, and we can just have a little bit of a puppy break whilst we're talking about video games. Here she is enjoying some daffodils. But yeah. And so that was a huge project for me and a huge undertaking. But I guess sort of I wanted to just sort of end in terms of this stuff that I'm talking about. We're thinking about where my work is now, that my experience sort of feels like it straddles these two extremes. On one end is working in this sort of DIY capacity of figuring things out, of really being part of a sort of culture and community, all the way up to being in this sort of much larger institution, having to sort of sort of benefit from sort of the practices in history and learning that museums have, and in terms of the way that you create exhibitions and much bigger budgets, but also that comes with a whole range of different constrictions and complexities and restrictions on the way that you can actually exhibit work. And so the things that I'm really interested in now is kind of, how do I sort of reconcile the differences and reconcile this sort of the distance between those two experiences of curating, to find potentially sort of like, not necessarily a middle ground, but just something that begins to take the best of both worlds, that begins to sort of develop and think of new things. Like we don't have to necessarily create these big sort of broad survey exhibitions that are looking at sort of this huge breadth of contemporary games, but we don't also just have to be sort of tying things together with gaffer tape in sort of the back room of a nightclub. It's like, okay, how do we begin to take ourselves seriously and do things differently? And so some of the work that I've done sort of since I left the V&A was back in 2020, I was the director of, or guest director for that year, of the Experimental Games Festival, Now Play This, which is sort of a great sort of festival that takes place in Somerset House in the UK. That being an event that took place in 2020 was one which did not happen in a physical venue like it did in normal years or in regular years, but instead was a virtual exhibition. And one of the things that was most inspiring that we undertook during that was trying to find, and I'm sure sort of a lot of people here that have done and dealt with sort of virtual exhibitions and experiences, is that sort of learning curve and reckoning that you have to go through with thinking, how do you capture the same magic and sort of embodied experiences and focus of attention that you can create within public venues and you can create within public exhibitions, but doing that in a virtual space. And so one of the projects which I'm really proud of that we undertook with that was a series of virtual tours and workshops that actually took place in a series of different video games. So one we brought, we sort of commissioned Robert Yang to undertake sort of a tour through, take through a series of players on a guided tour through the Black Mesa Research Facility from Half-Life. And the other one that we undertook as well was working with the game designer and artist Gareth Damian Martin to undertake a photography workshop, a landscape photography workshop within the video game No Man's Sky, which is what you can sort of see photographed here. And for me, it was a really interesting experience to just think of how that sort of bringing people together in video games and asking them to sort of look at the landscape and to look at that world differently in this quite interactive embodied experience just sort of created this different relationship that we can have with those games and different works. And for me, sort of the stuff that I'm interested in now is really sort of embracing the performativity of that work as well, and thinking, how does that potentially translate into different types of exhibitions and different modes of sort of way that we can display and think of work sort of very differently in public spaces. And
I'm really sorry to interrupt you, Mary, but we are running out of time. You know that these things are, so I'm really sorry to interrupt you. It was being really, really interesting, but we need to move on to you. So if you can just wrap it a little bit and then.
Yeah, sure.
I'm really sorry.
I'm not paying attention to the time at all, so
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay, because thankfully this is sort of the last image, but yeah, that work sort of kind of leads through to the last sort of project that I've undertaken, which was a collaboration with a host of sort of filmmakers and game designers internationally, which was part of Now Play This in 2020, which was the Grannies, which is a virtual, which is a multi-channel video installation piece, which is a work that will be sort of, we have been sort of exhibiting at film festivals internationally, and hopefully sort of being able to present in its installation format as it's sort of presented here. But I won't rattle on too much longer about that. But yeah, and I'll hand the floor over to the next speaker now.
Okay, so thank you very much for such an interesting talk. So we are moving to Matias. So Matias is the program coordinator of La Casa Encendida in Madrid and director of Me Gustas Pixelat, a festival devoted to the relationship between the performing arts and the digital world. Matias aims at creating new mechanisms for attention. He's inspired by how social media, video games, and cinema are transforming the way we empathize with and relate to each other. Although he trained as a choreographer, where he does now can no longer be seen as just dance or theater, film or new media, it is a living thing that grows and expands its form to whatever it needs to. So, Matias, the stage is yours. Whenever you're ready, you can start.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very honored to share the panel with these three beasts. So yes, I work for La Casa Encendida since 5 years. I coordinate this program called, I call it a curatorial program and not a festival, and later I will explain why. So it's called Me Gustas Pixelat, meaning I like to pixelate it. And since the very first edition, we set up a collaboration with ESNE, which is actually a strategic collaboration. The festival could be described as a live arts festival that finds synchronicities or points of encounters between the world of video games, digital culture, and technology with performance and performing art. It's not a digital festival, and sometimes it's misunderstood as a digital festival, but this is a performance festival with the gazing the digital culture. And my proposal came because after finding out that there was a very lack of context where to think about performance artists, how performance artists are affected by technology and are working about technology, not with technology. And at the same time, there was a big lack of recognition by the artistic community, the performance artistic community, of the value and cultural influence of video games. So Me Gustas Pixelat tried to fill this gap. We started to collaborate, ESNE and La Casa Encendida, as a way to bring the video game community to the performance context and to bring performance artists to the world of technology and video games. And I call it a curatorial program because every edition builds from the previous one. It's like we are trying to, along the years, we try to build a narrative that fills this gap I explained before. The collaboration with ESNE depends of the edition, depends on the topics we are working on. So basically, I propose several activities to David, the coordinator, and together we discuss how to implement it in the school and in collaboration with our audiences. I will go through the different editions. I will show you some videos. Like this, you can have in mind what the proposals become and how it looks also the festival. This is the first edition. And in the first edition, we worked with an artist called Claire Evans, and she gave a workshop on how to stay political, how to keep your political views when playing video games. And at the same time, she also presented her new book, where she rewrites the story of technology and video games just from the perspective of women and women achievements. This is the second edition. The second edition was about the embodiment of characters, and we invited Pablo Durango, a drag monster alien from Madrid, whose drag persona is called Onyx, and is inspired in video game characters. And they gave a workshop on dragging, it was a funny experience to bring the students by ESNE becoming drag queens, drag monsters, and so on. Also in the edition, here you see the pictures, the images. we organized a hackathon where we
Matias, sorry to interrupt you. I don't know, I'm not sure, but you're not sharing your screen, so we can't really see.
Ah, shit. Okay, yeah. I try again.
Yeah.
Sorry, I try again. Can you see it now?
Okay. Yeah, but you're not, okay, now, yeah. We can see now, yeah.
So this is the second edition I was telling you about the video game characters. And we organized a hackathon where we put together performance artists and video game developers. And the challenge was to make video games inspired by the practice of the performance artists. The funny thing is that it didn't go as expected, because all the video game developers wanted to make performances. So at the end of the hackathon, we had 7 performances rather than 7 video games ideas. Then the third edition got interrupted by COVID. We invited an artist from Germany called Julian Hessel with this piece, Automated Sniper. And the Automated Sniper is a performance that makes a shooter, a video game, a shooter, into a live performance. So the students of ESNE were going to learn about the technologies to make a shooter as a live performance. And also they were going to become the target of the live video game. So here in the images, you see 2 performers that at one point, they will be shot by a paintball machine. You see it here. And the whole piece is about making, it questions what it is actually playing a shooter and what happened to a body when you play it live. As I said, this edition got interrupted by COVID, so we never managed to really do it with the students. It was a shame. The next edition we had to suspend the collaboration also because of COVID. It was too difficult to work with the students with all the sanitary measurements. And the last edition was about the notion of neo-feudalism or techno-feudalism, depending on the scholar. And we invited a collective, a YouTube collective called 3 Person View. And it's a collective that creates documentaries, video game documentaries that puts video games in relation to the history of literature and art. So basically, they gave a workshop to the students on how to develop your own critical analysis of a video game from different disciplines and how to later edit it and develop your own discourse. These are the images of this edition that happened in March. And this is all from me. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Matias. Thank you very much. Okay. So we've got 15 minutes left to engage in a conversation, and there is a person who's got a question for you. He emphasizes that anybody can answer the question, so you're free to answer whoever is ready. So the person from the audience asked if it is difficult to convince or present the institutions or museums to carry out these exhibitions.
I would say it's a question of period of time. 20 years ago, it was, I guess, a bit different. I think that now it's more that the institution is asking for projects, sometimes to reconnect with the audience, certain type of audiences. So it's more that, but I'm not sure you will share my point of view, but I would say now the structures are asking for, maybe.
In my case, I find it more difficult to bring together different communities, to bring together the video game community to, for example, in my case, the performing art community. Both of them are very resistant to find different synergies and to see different ways to inspire each other. Like, I think the categories are very strict and the disciplines are also very frame. And also, for example, what happened during the first 3 editions, we managed to build a small community of students that kept coming to the activities of the festival. And in the 3rd edition, they were already asking me in advance what's going to be the activities this year. And after COVID happened, we lost them. Like this edition, they didn't come back. We had to start from scratch, creating the assignment. And the same for the performing artists. It's all the time starting from scratch.
I think there's definitely a feeling with a lot of sort of cultural institutions that I've sort of worked with, that there is a growing interest in engaging with the subject matter. But I think the complexities that I've faced is more whether or not institutions are prepared to engage with games in a way that you as a curator want to engage with games. So I think it really depends on the people that you're speaking to and the nature of the institution that you're talking to. Because when we say cultural institutions, we're talking a huge wide gamut here. And so I think for a lot of larger institutions, and the focus sometimes can tend to be sort of, great, this is a great way of getting in younger audiences and getting in sort of a different clientele to the one that we've got before, but hey, they don't know video games, so we're going to have to start at the beginning and we need to do an introductory show. And so sometimes it just pushes you into sort of perhaps a slightly different mindset or a different approach to games than perhaps you're looking to undertake. And so I think the complexities that I've sort of faced is institutions being prepared to allow you to approach the subject in quite nuanced and different ways, in ways that sort of allow us to explore niches, which I think is an area that we desperately need to engage with in terms of the way that we exhibit the work. Yeah, so I think there's definitely growing interest there, but I think there's a learning curve and sort of a slightly sometimes misstep between sort of where curators and creative practitioners are and where institutions are, and how they both sort of perceive the medium and how they want to sort of exhibit it.
Yeah, on my side, I think institutions are always very helpful. And of course, they always have an agenda. I think every 2 years they get a new agenda. So you always have to adapt on that. But usually you actually can do whatever you want, which is always good. Of course, they have some rules, like whatever, like the Institut Français, you have to work with French artists. You can't invite other people from around the world to this program, just if there is maybe another institution involved. But I think over the years, how this kind of collaboration was growing is just like intense. So, and as Isabelle as well said, I mean, you can have a lot of opportunities to make exhibitions. You just have to go to institutions and say, hey, I want to do that. And then they will find some budget because they're super interested. And of course, it's also, they want to have new audiences. Like Goethe Institute, they're selling usually a language school. It's a language school, right? And of course, they have this cultural institutions, do a lot of program in different kind of art fields. But of course, I mean, they want to have new students as well. So this is it's also why they also have a program to engage younger audiences. And same is with the museums. The museums also want to have younger or different audiences because especially when these are Naturkunde Museum, something like this, Deutsche Museum, what is kind of showing the history, because I mean, they lose people between 25 and 45, basically. So this kind of audience is not there anymore. They're not going in museums anymore. And this is something what they want to gather again and bring up new ideas and also use the technology. If it's AR or VR and want to create new spaces, playful spaces where they can show their objects and their narratives. It's a super interesting time, I think, for curators.
Okay, thank you, Thorsten, very much. So we are really running out of time, but I'm gonna ask you like a general question. We've got a few minutes left. So my question is in relation to the last question that somebody from the audience asked, and it is as the video game understood as a piece of art. And although it may seem pretty obvious, what can the video game offer that a piece of art traditionally understood as such as painting or sculpture, for instance, can't do? If we talk about video art or digital art, are we talking about the same thing? So whoever wants to start.
I don't know.
Isabelle, you go.
That? I don't know. Huh?
Okay.
But I was about to say that games are following a tradition in the art history, following the surrealist or the Dadaist or also the Fluxus movement. So in a, let's say, in a very subversive way. Then in terms of experience, there are so many different kind of games and game installation that it's hard to speak generally like that. But for sure, the idea is to experiment something and get inside the, there are many games that allow you to, for example, to wander inside a painting or to get inside, to immerse yourself. So, but then, yeah, there are so many different types of, I would say,
I mean, that's why we also call it playful media, or like the writer said, always playful arts. You know, I mean, this is not just video games. It's a completely a new scene of experimental artists, and they actually don't say that they're video game designers. Or, I mean, we at the festival we show video games, but also we show playful arts or playful media. What brings performance in there? What brings artistic expression in there, or experimentations, and also what is very important, that the content and the context is to the now. So it's not some kind of crazy narrative what is great to play, but I mean it's really something about the neighborhood, about the culture, about the food, or I don't know, so something small. And this is something what has very, very close something to do with a picture what is hanging, or a painting what is hanging somewhere. I like this kind of development, that it's interactive, of course, and that you can immerse yourself in there, and that it's basically, it's an art form what is connected through so many different art forms. There's music, sound design, there's art in there, there's programming in there. Programming is art, and I mean, this is something what is so super new and super fresh, and the development is crazy at the moment.
Yeah, I think for me as well, like in terms of like the question, that it's also sort of feels like it comes slightly loaded with this idea of whether, and it's something that we talk about a lot, like what does gamers offer that you can't get from anything else? And it's like, I don't feel that we necessarily have to put this as a medium or as a mode of creative expression in competition with other practices and other performances, because as Isabelle says, like it is a medium that is in conversation and in dialogue with all of these other practices. But I think for me, in terms of the reason why sort of this has value, is that this is video games, and this whole aspect of digital media is just a critical, fundamental part of everyday culture that generations of people now are brought up against and brought up with and experience. And it's a part of their lived experience. These are spaces that they've lived within. These are worlds that they've explored. These are sort of performances that they've undertaken. And for me, it's equally thinking about the tools, that this is the, like video games also speak to where sort of we are in terms of digital design tools and creative tools. And so for me, it's less about sort of, oh, we have to do it because it's better than this or it's better than that. Because like, actually, there's not a competitive element here. It's like, yes, they do things differently and they have sort of either they're connected or unique properties. But ultimately, it's like, look, this is a mode of creative expression that so many people are engaging with. And that for me is sort of the real justification for this, is that it's just sort of an acknowledgement that it's a critical, fundamental part of our culture. And that is the reason why so many creative practitioners are sort of playing with these tools and working within this space these days.
Matias, any thoughts on that?
No, I mean, for me, I totally agree with Marie. And in relation to that, I think I insist that we need to, I believe that we need to create synergies between different art and cultural disciplines. Like for me, I'm lucky that when a contemporary art curator curates an exhibition, for me it's crazy that it doesn't acknowledge video games. It's like that you see an exhibition about, I don't know, landscapes, and there is no reference most of the time to a video game landscapes, for example. It's just this click is not yet being made, and I think this is something that we are lacking, and the place to go. Like this self-referential video games exhibition that talks about video games history, that is only about video games, also lacks attention from other realms of life, and also in a way to attract people that doesn't belong to video games to the video game. You can find links to other aspects of their lives.
The only place where I saw that, it was like 3 or 4 years ago in at the Berlin Biennale. And it was really interesting. For once, games were really like
merged
a bit everywhere in the exhibition, but really like part of not per se, not just the game corner, but like illustrating, not illustrating, but related to the theme, or like exchanging with other artworks. And that was one of the first time I was seeing this kind of mix. And I do agree with you, it would be great to...
I would say that younger curators, in Spain at least, are starting to be more open, because I mean, their reference to video games are from since when they are a child, so they cannot escape to that. So I feel that the new generations will make the change for sure.
So thank you everybody for your participation today, and we are hoping that a new path is open, as Matias was saying before. So we hope for new generations to come and change a little bit the scenario. So it's been an honor to have you all in here. It's been a pleasure to be the host in this roundtable. So thank you very much for your interesting thoughts and your vision on the current situation and sharing your experience and work with us today. So thank you very much.
And thank you for the invitation.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Au revoir.
Bye.